Hi, this is Daniel Miller with NASCO, and we're here to talk about fair housing and how it relates to your co-op. And today I wanted us to talk a little bit about specifically the portions of Fair Housing Act that relate to disability and family status and how those relate to your co-op, because those can be a little bit more complicated than simpler questions around what is somebody's race or their nationality. Their disability may be invisible, their family status may not be obvious to you, and so those are things that you want to take special care to think about. So who is it that counts as having a disability? What is it that we mean when we say disability? Well, legally, under the Fair Housing Act, somebody is considered to have a disability if they have a physical or mental disability that substantially limits one or more major life activities, if they have a record of this kind of disability, or if people regard them as having this disability. So it's not just about whether a disability is visible to the co-op when somebody comes and applies. It may be that this is something that is part of their history and it continues to be an active issue for them. It may be that they are not, in fact, a person with this disability, but the co-op assumed that they were and treated them discriminatorily based on the assumption that this person had a disability. So be aware that it's not just whether you're disabled or dealing with a disability, it's also whether you have been or whether people see you as having been. So some common examples of disability would include hearing, mobility, or visual impairments. I think those are things that most people would instantly recognize. Somebody who is chair-bound, for example, or somebody who has a visual impairment, somebody who is deaf. Those are all examples of disability. But some other ones would include chronic alcoholism or drug addiction, chronic mental illness, AIDS or AIDS-related complex or the complications that come out of that, or developmental or cognitive disabilities. What would have and is still in some laws referred to as mental retardation. So those are all examples of disabilities that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. And earlier I mentioned that a person with a disability is somebody who is impaired in their major life activities. Well, some examples of that would be being able to walk and to talk, being able to see or hear, being able to breathe or perform simple manual tasks, being able to learn and remember things, being able to care for oneself. So those are all things that are protected. And somebody who is unable to do basic care for themselves, bathing, feeding, moving around, seeing and hearing, those are all things that would be considered a disability if somebody is prevented or has difficulty doing any of those things. So if somebody is a person with a disability under the Fair Housing Act, the co-op has an obligation to respect their legal protections and to make accommodations for that person. So what does that mean? It means that you can't refuse to let people make reasonable accommodations to their rooms or to the common areas at the co-op if they are doing this thing at their own expense so that they can use the housing facilities. So for example, if somebody says, I need to be able to put a peephole into my bedroom door, and the one that is there now is 5 feet off the ground, I'm chair-bound, I need one that is 3 feet off the ground so that I can see through it while I'm in my chair. The co-op can't say you're not allowed to drill a hole in your door. If this person is willing to do this at their own expense, if they say, I would like to install a grab rail into the bathtub so that I can more easily get in and out, and I will pay for this and I will restore it when I'm done. If that's the case, the co-op really needs to step away and say, this is what you need in order to be able to live here and use this facility, and we're not going to stand in your way. You are free to do these things. You may require that the member agree to put it back the way it was when they move out. Most co-ops decide not to do that. Most co-ops say, our bathroom is now more accessible than it was before, or we now have this ramp to get in the back door, or we now have an accessible peephole to look through the door. So most co-ops would see this as an improvement and something that the co-op can now be accessible to in ways in the future for other folks. It may be that the change that this person needed was disruptive for people who don't deal with this disability, and so in that case you might ask that they restore it. You can't refuse to make reasonable accommodations in your rules or your policies for the disabled person to use the housing. So I'll talk a little bit more about what a reasonable accommodation is, but be aware that this isn't just about grab bars and guardrails and ramps. This is also about making your co-op as an organization with programs accessible to people. And so if members are required to do labor for the co-op and somebody has a disability and they are unable to do some of the existing labor positions that you've created, be aware that it is very reasonable that that person asks that you create a position that can usefully participate and contribute to the co-op, but that does not require the physical abilities that you might have assumed people have. So you may have to create a new position, you may have to find other ways to shift your policies. So some examples might include somebody saying, well, the co-op has 8 parking spaces, but only one of them is near the door and is near the ramp that lets me into the building, and I'm just asking that you reserve that parking space for me. And the co-op says, well, the policy is that all the spaces are open to everybody and they're all up for grabs. And the person says, well, that's fine, but that also means that most of the time when I get home, I cannot get into my house, or it is very difficult for me to get into my house. And so the co-op would say, you know what, we're going to make an exception to this policy. It's perfectly reasonable that we do this small thing that makes a big difference for your ability to deal with living in this house and to be comfortable participating in this house and for it to be accessible to you. So a reasonable accommodation, that's a legal term that you'll hear. And what it says is that the co-op needs to make these accommodations, needs to make itself accessible to incoming members in a way that is not disruptive to the co-op's ability to exist. So a reasonable accommodation might be that a member comes in and says, co-op, I would like you to install a ramp that gets in the front door. I know that a ramp like this that's made of metal and can be put in front of the door to just get up that 7-inch rise into the front door. I know the co-op can buy that thing for $300 or $400 and just put it in place, and I'll be able to get in this door in my chair and it won't stop anybody else from using the door. Well, in that case, usually the co-op would be asked to do that, and the co-op would have to say that is reasonable. That $300 for a ramp is a reasonable maintenance expense for the co-op to be making. Whereas if somebody said, I would like you to build an elevator to the 4th floor, and the co-op says, our whole annual budget is $80,000 a year, and this elevator is going to cost $200,000. Well, probably that wouldn't be reasonable. The co-op is saying, we simply cannot afford to do this thing, or we're not capable of doing this thing. So that's not a reasonable accommodation. If somebody wanted to do that at their own expense, that's one thing. But if they're asking the co-op to pay for it, if they're asking the co-op to take on the work, it needs to be something the co-op is capable of doing. But in general, your co-op is going to find that people who are dealing with disabilities, they have experience dealing with these disabilities. They're aware of how this impacts their life, and they probably have some idea of how it's going to impact the rest of the co-op. So if you are just open and receptive to meeting people's needs, then you're probably going to find the people who are making these requests for accommodation are going to be making reasonable requests that everybody can understand and that the co-op is capable of meeting them partway. So some other reasonable accommodations. One thing to be aware of is that a service animal or a companion animal, they're not a pet. So if somebody has a guide dog or a companion animal or some other service animal that helps them in another way, that's not somebody that would have to pay a pet deposit because it's not a pet. They're not bringing this animal there for fun. This is an animal that they need to go through their basic living. And similarly, if a co-op has a no pets policy, then you can't refuse to let somebody move in with a guide dog. You'll sometimes see this, if you go to a restaurant, it might say, no pets allowed, and then have a second exception to that saying, this doesn't count service animals or something like that. So be aware that if you have a no pets policy, that doesn't apply to guide animals or to companion animals, and you can't charge that person a pet deposit. If a co-op is trying to balance the needs of different abilities or different people's needs, then be aware that you may have a no animals policy because you have people who are living with severe allergies. There have been courts that have found that allergies are a kind of disability. So there's no magic answer here. If you have somebody who has a genuine need because of their disability to have a companion animal or a service animal, and then somebody else who has a genuine need to not be around animals, you may have to just figure out the best reasonable compromise. You may say, there's just no way that we can meet both of these needs, and just communicate as honestly as you can about that. Or you may say, well, it actually would work out fine because we, if you are willing to live over here and you're willing to live over here, it can be arranged so that you'll never be exposed to this animal, or this animal won't come in the kitchen where the meals are prepared, right? So just do the best you can to meet people's needs. Also be aware that there's a difference between somebody's condition and somebody's behavior or actions. And so, for example, earlier I mentioned that one form of disability is if somebody has a chronic history of alcoholism or drug addiction. That's not the same thing as drinking or using drugs. It means that somebody came to your meeting and they said, I feel like it's fair to let the co-op know this about myself, but I am a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for X amount of time, and this is how that impacts my daily life. I just don't want it to be a surprise after I move in. But it's not something that'll be an issue, right? Then the co-op can't say, well, that person used to have an addiction to heroin, and so we're not going to let them move in. But that's not the same thing as saying, this person is using heroin, and so we're not going to let them move in. And that same thing can apply to service animals. So it's one thing to say that I have a disability which requires me to live with this service animal, but it's another thing if that service animal were to attack another member. Then you'd say, well, you need to have a different service animal. Your service animal is attacking people. The issue isn't that you have this animal, it's that this animal is attacking people. And so the same would apply across these different situations. So, and it doesn't have to be that somebody has relapsed and begun using these substances that they're addicted to. If somebody were to relapse, you would treat that behavior or those actions as separate from their condition of having this addiction. If somebody were to be using drugs and that's against your policies or a violation of your lease, or were to, threaten another person because they were drunk and, sort of lost control of the situation, those are all separate from whether or not they have a history of alcoholism or drug addiction. Family status is also something that's protected. The most common example of a family status is going to be whether a person has children. So just be aware that a co-op is not legally allowed to deny somebody housing because they have children. This is something that may be concerning to a lot of co-ops, in particular a lot of student co-ops. I think the experience you're going to find most of the time is that the co-op should be as open as possible, show people all of the available rooms, talk about what the responsibilities of a member are, talk about what the services provided to members are, and people are going to make their own decision about whether or not this is an appropriate environment that meets their needs and the needs of their family. And if your co-op is a space that they feel is not an appropriate fit for them with their children, it may be that they didn't understand what the co-op is going to be like, and they got there and they said this is all wrong. It may also be that they said, you know what, this actually sounds great. This sounds like a really good fit for myself and my child, and they want to move in which case, just be open and honest and communicate clearly about what's expected of them and what the co-op provides, and you'll probably be fine. Another example might be having an adult relative. So you might have a disabled parent or some other relative who needs to be with you and is dependent on you. And so in that case, that can also be considered a kind of family status. And marital status is also something that's protected. So just be aware this is something that may not be immediately visible or obvious when somebody comes and applies, but all of these things are protected by law. And in particular, people who are looking for affordable housing and have children, it's not uncommon for those people to face different kinds of discrimination. So the co-op should be aware and respectful of those people's experiences, and just be aware that if they're able to meet the requirements of membership and they are interested in being members of the co-op, the co-op is there to meet their needs just like anybody else's.